So when I hear about something, like using a different modulation technique that could be more efficient then I'm excited about that because that's easy. It's really easy. You can measure it, you can do the math on it, you can do the cost, you can do the impact. And I kind of feel that I wish that we focused on things more like that more often. I give another example, hollow core fiber.
Mm,
Um, pretty much invented in Southampton
that's
University.
right. I remember writing about that.
Luminicity developed it. I actually worked with them as an advisor. Great capability. Microsoft acquired the company, and this week put out an announcement that they're rolling this new type of fiber out into their data centers, which it gives them more capacity and reduces latency. That's the sort of things that customers just they get it right away. Whereas NFV, like no one cares. I don't have a customer that ever phoned me up and said, "Hey Neil, I'm buying BT because you're running NFV." It's just like what?
Hello, and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. You may be able to hear, and you'll certainly be able to see that we didn't make it into the studio today, and it's all Pierre's fault for getting the flu. To be fair, it sounds like he's feeling rotten, and I don't particularly want the flu. So we've adjusted accordingly, and we've got to thank our special returning guest, Neil McRae from Juniper Networks, who was going to come into the studio and has adapted to the new circumstances. And the bonus we get, Neil, from having you remote is you're in your Aladdin's cave of pinball machines there. Why
Yeah,
don't you
that is
tell us what
true.
that's all about?
Yeah, so as most of the world knows, I'm a bit of a gaming pinball nut. So the pinball machines are great at many things, except for they're big and hard to move. So I have
Mm.
a room in my house where I've been collecting games for hundreds of years.
How many machines you got there
In this room, 21.
in this
You can
room?
see. Yeah, well, actually this is the only room because my wife has banned pinball anywhere except this room.
Yes, this is a
Oh,
proper
which is
man cave, isn't it?
Yeah, so behind me, this one is Metallica. This
Oh,
one's
excellent.
James
Look,
Bond
got the
60th.
t-shirt, mate. Got the
Yeah,
t-shirt.
I've actually got the poster on that game, which you can't see because of focus. I was going to bring it for you to the office, but I'll need to
Oh,
figure out another way of getting it to you. But yeah, this is just so I actually I had a couple of charity events here with telecoms people. We raised a load of money for autistic kids.
ah, good
And
cause.
actually, I get autistic kids, kind of teenagers. They come here kind of every couple of months, and what through a friend, we've found out that actually the pinballs are a really great t kind of task or thing for them to do. They really enjoy it. So
Yes, I could see that. It's very
I'll open up.
immersive.
I'll
Yeah,
open up every couple of months for them.
brilliant. Okay, well, nice one. Well, it's great to see it. And one day I'll have to come down there and play on the Metallica one.
I have a beer
Obviously, I'm not
full
going to
I have a
compete with
fridge full
you.
of beer.
Yeah,
You do
yeah.
take them around though, don't you, Neil? You have sort of taken them to events and things in the past, or
Yeah, so we run. I never do things half baked. So we run a big tournament called the UK Open at the end of September, and it's like we kind of set up in this Hilton hotel for the weekend, move 60 odd games, live stream it. We have 175 players from all over the world that come and play. It's all online. All the games actually. We have these. This is so we're gonna. This is a an IoT device that puts any pinball machine on the internet.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
so just above me, you can't see them on this, but there's someone a friend of mine called Jay Adelson, who's ex Equinox. If you've been around that while, but he developed this. I've been helping him, and you put this in a pinball machine, and you get all sorts of data out of it. We can use it to score, to stream, etc. And it's interesting because pinball's moving into the network space, which for me is like two great passions of mine coming together.
Right,
So
and totally. That's just like
fantastic.
Neil McRae
Yeah,
heaven.
absolutely. So yeah, I mean, and so I'm kind of when I'm not working, I'm usually doing something with pinball. which is some people play golf, I play pinball.
Mm.
Neil, you need to find a way of bringing space exploration into it as well, and have like a
That's
three-way
true.
thing.
That's his third thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, around the room, there's a load of space stuff. You can see it there. You can see here. You can see a space shuttle poster signed
Right.
by the Kelly twin. But
I
yeah,
think you've got to. I don't know. I mean, they're presumably are direct competitors of yours, but one company to liaise with on that would be Nokia, because they're always going on about putting base stations on the moon. So
yeah,
there
for
we are.
all the people that are on the moon, that'll be handy.
Yeah, exactly.
No, actually, before I left BT, I was kind of I worked with Nokia for a few things, and I saw what they were doing, which is the challenges, and actually Vince Cerf, the father of all our networking stuff that we do today, really, he's been working at Google as on how do we make the internet work in space. So
Mm.
it, I'm not close to it, but I've kind of read some of the papers, and there's some big challenges with latency becomes such a big issue. So something I keep an eye on. And obviously, in the last few years, we've talked about this before, satellite communications have gone from nowhere to kind of
Yeah.
thing a lot of people are talking about. So, I know 4 years ago, just after COVID, I went to the SATCOM show in Washington, and it was amazing to see how satellite communications have moved on. I mean, and then you've got, device to air and all these kind of 5G plus type use cases coming along. So yeah, all those things are coming together. It's great to see it as a geek like I am. It's brilliant to see it.
Well, we might put a pin in that, because that was something that came up in my World Congress. So I've made a mental note to talk about that. I mean, before, I mean, I don't think we've been out and about, Ian. I don't think there's much opening bollocks. The messages on LinkedIn telling us how great we are have dried up. So it turns out we've got about 5 fans, but that's cool. That's better than nothing. So I don't have any of those to read out, and we haven't been out with anyone, so I'll keep that short and sweet.
Well, it's post WC, isn't it? It's that time of year,
Yeah, like the last
slim.
couple of days, the news has been dry as a bone, man. We've had to be really creative at digging stuff up. I wrote about foldy phones today. Maybe that'll come up. Um, what was I going to say? So yeah, we'll probably just move on. And before we move on to like the main thing, where I'm going to ask Ian like his thoughts on NWC, and then we'll deal with the topics that leads into. Yeah, I've got to deal with the elephant in the room. Neil, I apologize now. I think I already called you Ian. Neil and Ian, for some reason, I get easily mixed
Yeah,
up.
I get it all the time, Neil and Ian. It's not just you
Yeah.
that does it.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. You work for Juniper Networks? Probably about 5 pods ago, we were chatting to you and going, oh look, you're going to get bought by HPE, and it still hasn't moved on. So I was just wondering what, obviously if you're in the areas of like regulation, all that sort of thing, presumably you're quite constrained about what you can say. But what's the current state of play with that situation?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, it's one of those things that these deals can sometimes go through, which is you have introspection. So the DOJ are kind of looking at this
It's in the
deal.
US. Yeah.
Yeah, in the US Department of Justice. Actually, it's been approved here in the UK and in Europe.
We're normally
They've
the ones screwing it up, aren't we?
well, I'll be, I think, as I remember, one of the concerns was definitely European approval, because it's, that's, that is, you know, the right thing to do. Is this good for the industry? Is it good for the market? I mean, we feel that it is. We feel that it's a great deal for customers and for the industry. And HP feel the same. So, there's a lot of still. I'm not actually involved in any of it, but a lot
Yeah.
of the effort is to kind of actually try and make this deal happen, which I think there's a lot of capabilities that both companies have that I think would be valuable to put together for customers and for network building. So that's pretty much all I know and all I can say about it.
Yeah.
But
Well, sorry, carry on.
no,
As I,
go.
Go on, Ian.
I was just going to say, as I understand it, like that it had to get approval by 15 jurisdictions, and 13 of them did it quite quickly. It was only 2 that sort of kicked up a fuss. The main
Yeah.
one obviously being the DOJ, and Israel just basically follows what the Americans do all the time. So
Yeah.
that was the other one. But
And
Yeah,
vice
typically
versa.
that's what I understand. Again, I've
yeah,
never been involved in a deal like this. So every acquisition I've done has been kind of UK or Europe focused, so it's been a bit more
yeah.
straightforward.
And the rationale was very much about this, which we might talk about a bit anyway, but not from a kind of merger perspective, just from the capabilities of the technology. But it's very much sort of looking at the wireless LAN side of things, and this idea that bringing together Juniper and HPE with their kind of Wi-Fi assets would create a too powerful player. Which to me, I have to say, like trying to look at it impartially, seems a difficult case to make because that market's quite fragmented and you do have a few big players with like Cisco is obviously the other big sort of one up there, but there's a lot of it's not like looking at the radio access network market where a merger between Nokia and Alcatel-Lucent went through a few years ago when it was already pretty consolidated. It looks quite
Yeah,
competitive.
and I think that's the basis for our view, which is, we aren't, the market has still got many players in it at all levels as well, from consumer all the way up to enterprise. So, we wait and see what happens. But look, one thing I'll say is, I've worked for Juniper for 2 years. It's an absolutely fantastic place to work. I've loved absolutely every minute of it. And even if this deal wasn't to happen for whatever reason, we're a very strong standalone business. If you look
Yeah.
at our last set of results, you'll see, how well we've performed in what was a very difficult market. And the plans that we've got moving forward excite the hell out of me. So either way, there's pros and cons of both directions, but either way, we're still going to be connecting people, connecting customers, and delivering networks that customers love the experience of, and nothing's going to change that, irrespective of what happens with this deal. So yeah, let's see
Okay.
what happens.
Indeed. And my only last thoughts on it, and I'm certainly not inviting you to comment on US politics, Neil. But my last thoughts of it is like the vibes that have come out of the current administration, and granted, there are all sorts of vibes coming from all sorts of different directions, but tends to be a little bit more pro business, a bit more pro. That's the impression I get, a bit more pro M&A. They're certainly very protective of some of their big tech, which is why some of the rhetoric coming from people like the vice president towards Europe is as aggressive as it is. So my gut feel is if it has any bearing on it, and actually, ideally, the political environment shouldn't have any bearing on regulation and competition stuff. But if it does, I would expect it to be, pro M&A, but who knows? I mean, it's just stick your finger in the air and see which way the wind's blowing with these people in charge
Yeah,
right now. So
this is sort of almost counterintuitive in the current environment. I think for it to have run into problems, I don't see it being a reflection of like the administration or anything. It's the opposite to what you think would be going on. So it's like someone's got to be in their bonnet at the DOJ about one particular aspect of the deal, which is pretty much how Antonio Neri made it out to me when I interviewed him. I think it's in my story that I wrote at MWC on this.
right.
Yeah, and look, I think both HP and Juniper were kind of positioning it, almost in the same position as what you guys are saying. Ultimately, we want the best networks for all of our customers, and we want the best infrastructure. Deal or not, that's going to happen. So
Yeah.
it is, but look, I think everyone's looking at the world's definitely a changed place in the last few months, and everyone's adjusting. Um, you know, for me, actually, an element of uncertainty is where I kind of get a little bit more excited because it
Right.
means stuff's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Disruption.
but and my hats off to the Juniper team because we delivered some amazing platforms last year. Our new PTX, the fastest router in the world. We got the new fastest firewall in the world that's really making a big hit with cloud players. And our Mist Wi-Fi product, it customers love it because it lets them focus on what their business is rather than fixing their Wi-Fi. So and
Yeah.
AI driven. So we're still delivering some great stuff for customers, and that I was up at 5 a.m. this morning talking to a customer in Australia about that, and that's the passion of Juniper and customer focus is something I think a lot of our industry could learn about because having worked in many telcos, customer is not always the first thing that's on our minds, which
Yeah.
is in this world is just not really feasible, basically.
Yeah, I remember years ago I first encountered that term where people said we're a customer centric company. And I thought, well, what the fuck is the alternative to being customer centric? But
Yeah.
then obviously you get into it and you realize, especially when you're within a big company, and I stress for any of my for any of the people further up the food chain from me from Informer, I'm not necessarily referring to Informer specifically, but you can see how companies, and especially bigger companies, can get so bogged down in their internal processes and their internal incentive structures and that sort of thing, where the customer sometimes is a bit of an afterthought. And obviously, everyone should be customer centric because they're the ones that bring in the revenue. So yeah, that's an interesting thing, and it's good to hear that you guys have got that memo. So yeah, I think what I really wanted to do with this, with having you on as a guest, obviously you're a regular returning guest, is do another bit of a MWC recap. So we did one the sort of week after with analyst John Strand, and that went in quite a sort of geopolitical direction.
Unsurprising.
Yeah,
That is
yeah.
right.
So much so that Ian was going, I'm just waiting for us to fucking talk about telecoms.
Yeah.
And so I thought perhaps in part to reward Ian for his patience, but also because it plays to your many strengths, Neil. Let's focus a little bit more on technology, but let's start by asking just an open question of you, Neil, like what your major takeaways from the show were.
Yeah, I mean, I think my first takeaway is what wasn't there. I don't think I saw a 6G logo anywhere.
Uh,
Um, and I have to say, going into the show, I was a bit nervous about that because, look, I think it's, you guys write about it every week. We live it. 5G isn't where we thought it would be, where we hoped it would be. And I think to bang the drum on 6G without having some element of a drains up on what happened with 5G and how do we make it better. I
yeah,
think anyone coming in and banging the 6G drum loudly probably wouldn't have gone down well. So,
no,
and actually there was more of a focus on what can we do with 5G? How do we optimize it? How do we bring the cost down? How do we really make it the valuable platform that we believe it could be? And there's some exciting use cases. But I think private networks, there's a lot about private networks and how that might be a use case. I spoke on a panel about that, and it's clear that that's still. I still feel that's an area of immaturity and early development as opposed to super mature. And I think the whole 5G versus Wi-Fi, we should probably kick the tires on that a little bit
yeah, we
later
can
on.
get straight into that actually because it's relevant. A pod. I don't know if you heard it, Neil, that we did with a colleague of ours, Pablo Tomasi, a few weeks
Yeah,
ago.
yeah,
We spoke about that a fair bit. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that sort of either
yeah.
or and the pros and cons and all that?
I mean, I'm kind of I have this reputation that I'm pro or anti technology. Actually, I'm pro or anti-customer. It's kind of what, and also, look, in this industry, if you're not making money to invest in the future, then you have no future. You might have a great product that you sell for a year or 2 years or maybe 3 years, but if you then don't use some of that money to create the next thing, then you're dead. And
Mm,
so when I look at technology like private 5G and Wi-Fi, I think I don't think there's an or here. I think there's always an and. Private 5G is great for kind of big campuses where you've got, almost like an airport-sized campus where, making Wi-Fi work there. It's not impossible, but there's definitely advantages of using private 5G. And again, the airport case, more security, devices that are easier to manage with SIMs, etc. There's definitely positive use cases for private 5G, but there's also massive downsides. You effectively become a mobile operator to some extent. And yes, in private 5G, you're slimming down some of the things that make you a mobile operator, like authentication and SIMs and devices, but you've still got that whole plethora of things to manage, or your service provider's managing that for you. With
Mm.
Wi-Fi, I mean, I'm on Wi-Fi right now talking to you guys, and it just works. And
Yeah.
in our space, in Juniper, again, I don't work in on the enterprise side too much, but our goal with Wi-Fi is to make it the reliable thing that no one talks about, because you know what it's like. You come in the office, you turn your laptop on, and the Wi-Fi is down. It's like chaos.
Yeah.
What we're doing with Mist and our AI platform is making that pain go away, and we've got real results on that where. We've gone into a business, like some big businesses, some massive supermarkets, some massive branch networks where, they've had thousands of tickets on Wi-Fi, and we've taken 90% of them away, and we've got that over and over and over again. It's not a one-off. And
And is AI, sorry to butt in, is AI a big part of that? Because we talk about AI quite a lot, often skeptically. I'm sure you've been on the pod where I've gone on about a Terminator and stuff. But
oh,
in
yes.
terms of like less utopian slash dystopian use cases and more immediate ones, are we seeing significant advances in AI when it comes to just nuts and bolts problem solving?
Absolutely. I mean, AI ops. I mean, what's one of the biggest challenges when you turn a laptop on and boot it up is you run out of IP addresses. And that's such a simple thing for AI to fix. Oh, I'll just add more. Boom, done. And I'll send an email to the op to say, by the way, we had this problem because there was a meeting in this office that normally isn't there. So that's why things change, So AI ops is a core part of our strategy at Juniper. And, we've been in that space for, I mean, I think I first met Rami about talking about AI almost 6 or 7 years ago. So it's something we've been working on long before generative AI came along. And, we've built on some of the other developments so you can actually talk to our AI platform and understand what's going on in the network. We have this thing called Marvis Minis that creates almost like a digital twin of the network, and you can use the AI to kind of simulate stuff. And I've said this on to you guys before when I was at BT and here, the network has got to a level of complexity and of experience demands that humans can't run it anymore. And I'm not saying that we have some weird kind of AI monster running the network, but with so many protocols, so much technology, so many users, so many use cases that when I started Demon Internet years ago, the only thing we did on it was send emails and download Usenet News. Now there's so many life critical missions on the network. There's and then you've got the entertainment. So many people use the network in so many different ways that to try and use humans to solve that in a five nines world where it's got to work pretty much all of the time, it just isn't feasible anymore. And actually, I recognized this at the Olympics in 2012. So BT, we did the Olympics, and one of the scary things about that was one of the biggest events, the 100-meter race. It's a 10-second event.
Yeah, you can't miss any of
And
it.
and wait a minute, how often do we pull the network to see if it's working? Every 15 minutes. So I'm thinking, crikey, how will we know if anyone actually saw Super Saturday? We won't. It'll be Twitter. Someone will tell us on Twitter. So
Oh my God.
coming out of that,
That must have made you nervous.
yeah, I mean, I had hair before that. And I mean, yeah, actually, Kevin and the guys that ran that did a phenomenal job. But there was a lot of big challenges that we took away from that, and actually, it started us down the path of real-time telemetry, which is one of the things that AI needs to be able to actually see what's going on. So, that AI journey, I would suggest started, as far back as then, because without the data, AI is just a thing that burns power. So. But I fast forward to now, and I see op service providers being able to forecast the performance of their network because they've got this data and they're using AI. Is it 100% right? Of course not. But does it give them a compass that says, actually, if we go down this path, we think that this is going to work. And most importantly, actually, if we do this, well, we're pretty sure it's not going to work. And that is, insanely valuable. I kind of was building networks for 30 years. I wish we had some of the tools that we've got now back then, because we probably would have accelerated the kind of take up of networks. And again, I've talked about this before, where we've done a phenomenal job at connecting, this device, but there's so much more we need to connect. And again, humans just can't do it. So, and that's where
Mm.
Wi-Fi and private 5G and also public 5G and come in, because you need a platform that can scale in the billions, runs day and night, is efficient and sustainable, and delivers value to customers. And I think with private 5G, in my experience, that value to customers is the area where I think we've still got huge amounts of work to do. And that is, it's easy to put radios up and plug kit in. That, I mean, we've done that all of our lives. What's really difficult is to work with a business to say, actually, if you change your process like this and you use this technology here and here, we can take 50% of the cost of it out. And
So the wireless tech's got to be part of a bigger business process mix.
100%. If it's not, and I've seen this when I was at BT. We went in, we saw, we had private networks that customers couldn't get their business to move towards them. We've seen others that have been hugely successful. So things, and actually that success was driven by necessity. So, we've seen ports where they had some regulation around air quality, which meant they needed to go out and build a sensor network. And private 5G was actually private 4G. So, private mobile networks everyone talks about it like it's something new. It's actually been around for a very long time. They
Mm.
initially deployed private 4G with sensors, and all of a sudden, they've got a whole bunch of data and telemetry on the air quality. What is it? Are they legal in terms of the regulations? Is there certain things they could change to make the air quality better? And then building on from that, they've seen the value of the network, and then they've said, okay, can we add some sensors that help health and safety so that people don't get injured in something like a port where there's lots of moving mechanical engineering stuff, and they want to keep people safe. So, but it's a journey, and in my experience, businesses tend to move slowly, especially those that are, where they've got a big product line or big production line. And the ones that embrace it is where there's kind of necessity. So I look at the car industry, they've embraced private 5G and automation massively because they've had
Yeah.
to. And I think there's I've seen other areas where that's spilled into, where just a simple network with some visual monitoring, so some cameras that are watching what's going on on the production line. Something happens, and it's because Tony wasn't there to press button X, and they're able to say, okay, how do we fix
Yeah.
that in the future? So I think that, so if I rewind back, I think, look, there's the private 5G and Wi-Fi and connectivity overall. I think there's sectors where we need all of it. And actually, one of the things that we've been working at Juniper is a control plane for private 5G and Wi-Fi. And we've been trialing this with some customers to ensure that, when devices move between things, or when we need certain qualities, we might push the device to a certain thing. That works as well as it should be.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, how they coexist, because you superficially you hear about like tension between sort of cellular and Wi-Fi worlds, especially when they're competing for spectrum and that sort of thing. But obviously, you want to have a best of breeds, mix and match whatever suits the circumstances, and that requires dynamic switching between the two, doesn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And our good friend Dean, I often talk to him about this. The future of all these networks is heterogeneous. There's no silver bullet network anymore. There's no silver bullet technology. It's how do we make all these things work together? And I'd add satellite, to that mix as well, because so private 5G is great to a certain campus size, but if you're a farmer with sheep, miles
Yeah.
apart, and some of these
IoT
huge,
sheep.
well, I mean, people chuckle about it, but there's some farming regulations where they have to report on stuff like that, and
Right.
it's really difficult for them. It's online reporting. So, I mean, I think
It's
we're
a
still
common
some way.
network. Yeah, that'll be on
Yeah.
the public, all that stuff. Are there instances where you would have, because one of the use cases for private 5G, I mean, it's going into some environments where people might see Wi-Fi as an alternative, and one of the claims it's made is, oh, it's licensed spectrum, it's more secure. There are things you can do with network slicing. There's guarantees you can provide. There's latency benefits. All this gets thrown out, and I never really hear, probably because we don't talk to Wi-Fi people as much, a response from the guys involved in things like Wi-Fi 7 about all of this. I'm kind of wondering if some of that's a bit overblown.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, I think Wi-Fi 7 brings in a lot more kind of those capabilities. And we see, Wi-Fi 7, being deployed in lots of locations because of that. But I mean, I would say in terms of, so we have this network slicing, when I look at that, there's definitely a few use cases where I think there's some capability on that. But one example is emergency services type networks where just having some separability on that I think is helpful. I actually don't think you need it, but I think it does make certain challenges easier. But Wi-Fi 7, we've got quite a lot of the capabilities that are in the mobile network. Um, and let's also not forget the billions of Wi-Fi devices that are out there. So every light bulb in this room is Wi-Fi powered. Are you gonna? Are you
What,
gonna?
just is that just you, or is that generally?
Oh, so in this room, every single. I mean, I'm
I see.
because my
This is a
networking.
Neil McRae early
Everything I do
adopter thing.
is network driven. But and in the
Right.
future, I think that'll be true because you want to have, look, we're in a world of energy challenges, using energy more effectively, lights coming on when you need them. You've seen these motorways that as a car comes along, they light up the motorway, and making sure that that's working, is a use case for the network. So, I kind of feel that these two things, and then you've got some specific equipment where it's a sensor or it's some heavy machinery where connecting it because of noise or because it's mobile, connecting it to a private 5G network makes it work. But also, the other thing we see is what I call a kind of hybrid 5G network where there's some parts of it are private, but they've extended it in a kind of virtualized way onto the public network, because they've got needs that building a dedicated network might be too expensive, or it might just be they've got multiple locations. So I think we're seeing all these networks work together better, serve different use cases, and serve different demands. But ultimate basic latency and bandwidth, there's not a lot to draw between them. And the most demanding latency needs on the planet right now are video gamers, and every single one of them, Wi-Fi is not good
On
enough. They're,
Wi-Fi.
they're plugging in cables. So
Right.
um, don't forget that in
Ethernet.
that
Yeah.
in that discussion, fixed networking still plays a significant part on certain use cases because it just takes away 10, 20 milliseconds, and that in some use cases, that's massive.
Is there much sign of people, because you mentioned like you were talking a bit about network slicing there, but people actually use not doing either of those things, Wi-Fi or private, but doing what was talked about maybe a bit more years ago during the hype phase, having slices on the BT is apparently due to launch some network slices this year. Howard Watson was telling me at MWC, because it's now got its standalone rollout that covers pretty much half the country, I think, in terms of population. But is there much sign of it happening anywhere? People using a slice of a public network to do a factory service or something like that, rather
And
than doing private
and
5G?
before you answer,
Yeah.
Neil, I'm going to interrupt because I'm going to let you two chat while I go and get another beer. That's one advantage of being at home. So you carry on.
I'll have a martini, please, Scott.
Yeah, gonna
Um, yeah. So, look, I think in, I have seen a couple of use cases. Actually, the guys at Vodafone here in the UK did a really good use case with broadcast. I think during the coronation of King Charles.
yeah.
And actually, broadcast is one of those use cases where I do think there are some advantages of slicing potentially. Perhaps not in so in some ways, perhaps, when it's a big event, you can carve off some capacity. My only nervousness is that if you carve off capacity, what customers are losing on that side, and it's not, it's not going to make capacity appear from nowhere. So if you haven't got enough capacity, this isn't going to help you. But ensuring that, you know, the broadcast of live TV or live video is happening in real time, I think is definitely a use case. However, again, you're still looking at decent amount of latency to get the transmission out to a kind of play out location. And you've seen it on TV where, someone tweets that someone scored a goal because they were at the match, and 10 seconds later it turns up on TV. So but I do think broadcast, and when I was at BT, we did a 5G slice and trial with BT Sport that showed some promise. I think the other area for slicing is unmanned devices. We talk about drones, and I think by now we all expected drones to be delivering us beer and flying in medical supplies, and we're still miles away from that, which most of us that flew drones would know, knew that's the case. But I still feel that there's certain use cases where being able to control unmanned vehicles or having some element of telemetry on unmanned vehicles would be useful. I don't think you're going to fly unmanned vehicles using the network as it is today. I think they need to have local intelligence, much like the self-driving cars, which are, probably, I think, still some way away. But having, as technology progresses, having something that's dedicated to that area, I think definitely, I think there's use cases where that is. I think the question is, and this is the same, I kind of reflect on the past in terms of private networks. So, we had ATM frame relay, IP came along, VPNs, etc. Now most people are working from home using the internet. Whereas before you'd have a dedicated line and you'd have all this dedicated infrastructure, and we've made the internet so good you don't need it anymore. So my question is does that continue to happen in Wi-Fi and other networks and such that that private 5G might be a transient thing that 10 years from now actually we don't need it anymore because we've solved certain challenges in other ways. So I kind of hope it is, because I want networks to be as the easiest, simplest, most valuable thing to use. I think the simpler and easier we make it to use, I genuinely believe the more money we make out of it, and the more money we make, the more we can invest, the more we can build stuff.
Isn't one no, you go ahead, Ian. Sorry.
I was just going to say, because you were talking about heterogeneous networks there, and that sounds like it plays a big part in that. This idea, certainly if you had a control plane that can move people between Wi-Fi and 5G more easily, I think it's a frustration just of common consumers that you in London, you go into a coffee shop and you lose your 5G connection, then you're messing around with passwords and stuff to get onto Wi-Fi. Those are sort of common problems. I know there's one view that
that problem we have to fix. That's just frankly infuriating. It's like this
is what 6G should be about. I know we mentioned Dean and William Webb have been on about this. And I think 6G is maybe one of the things we're going to talk about, but there doesn't seem to be much going on in that from certainly the stuff that's been coming out of South Korea. It's maybe to be expected because it's a mobile group and it would require a certain degree of collaboration that's obviously not happening with other organizations for it to reach that point. But certainly the stuff that seems to have been going on in the last few weeks and the discussions that have been happening haven't mentioned that at all from what I can see, this idea of sort of heterogeneous networks.
Yeah, I'm kind of with Dean on some of his thinking on that, where I think the most important thing 6G needs to solve is coverage. There's still way too many places where there's no coverage, and because of that, the use cases aren't developed because they need to rely upon that coverage. I said we've connected the iPhone, great, fantastic, but that isn't everything, and actually in many cases we haven't connected that. And this isn't a criticism of the operators, because having worked for one, it's hard to roll out coverage everywhere and generate value for you to be an economic organization that can survive. But I do think that there are there are more things we need to do in the control plane such that if there is connectivity, there's some sort of, exchange of, hey, I need this connectivity for this kind of usage. It could be, the great one I love because I recently lost my phone is Find My Phone, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, I'm getting off a plane. I've got my phone in my hand. I'm walking down. I'm like, just everything's catching up. Some guy flips around, whacks my phone. It flies off and goes down the side of a plane, like in the underbelly of the plane.
Oh,
And
I
I'm like,
see. Somewhere you're not allowed to go.
yeah, and somewhere that's not. I'm like thinking I'm never going to see this phone ever again. And I found it amusing that I was able to watch my phone on this 767 fly all over the world for almost 2 weeks before the battery died. And there's an example of something, right? That's so simple, and it's using a network, using a network that's okay. It's Apple's network, and Android's got something similar, but it's just, hey, I'm going to use a little bit of resource here to provide a service that everybody values. I actually did get my phone back amazingly, but
You did.
thanks to United
Oh, right. Well, they deserve a shout out.
yeah, well, I mean, I genuinely thought I'm never seeing it again. And by the way, if you lose a phone, the documentation you have to fill in for your insurance is just insane. I'll have a rant about that another day, but oh my God.
Right.
Um, but look, if and how do we bring those heterogeneous networks together such that there can be a business model or the technology I think is doable, but what's the business model that says, hey, I've seen that there's a Wi-Fi thing here. Okay, it's a private Wi-Fi for this retailer, but I've got this need that can I negotiate with you and get connected because I've got this need. And I think
Hmm.
all of a sudden you start to unlock, because look, everywhere in every town there's a quick fit that's got Wi-Fi. Every town there's a bank or a post office or a retailer. And if there's a limited connection, how do I get on board? And I think when you start looking at it through that lens, you think actually there's a lot more connectivity out there that just isn't being leveraged in the best
Yeah.
way. And I kind of feel that that's one of the things 6G has to solve.
But I've got one question about sort of ubiquitous coverage. And by the way, I got myself a bigger beer, so I don't have to.
Oh yeah,
say
before
it
you ask
so
that, Neil,
quick.
have you got a quick bit of a tangent, quick one? Have you got an iPhone 16?
I do know I've got a 15.
Because I'm wondering whether to get an iPhone 16. I'm due an upgrade. I'm wondering whether I should just stick with what I've got, which is a 14. But yeah,
It's
anyway.
kind of March, so they're about to announce a new one. So
Yeah.
I'll be on the verge of waiting for the new one.
But it wouldn't get released till September, would it?
Yeah, typically. I mean, I've got a 3-year cycle on phones, I think now.
That's sensible.
Only because just the pain of moving. You've got to move. Like I've got like loads of like security stuff and bank stuff, and even that we've somehow made it more complicated than I think it really needs to be.
Like your
But
stored credit cards and all that sort of thing.
yeah, I mean, not. So I was in. So when I lost my phone, it was a reminder of how we are tagged to these devices now. Um, I couldn't do anything. I literally had to phone a colleague at work and to get the help desk number so I could get
Hmm.
onto the network because we've got dual, and I just everything. I couldn't do anything. And I was having to potentially. I was looking for a fax machine at one point. I was like, oh my God, how can this be true? But when not having, so I didn't have my phone for about a week, and I was in Chicago, and it was painful. Luckily, I managed to get my iPad to do most of what my phone did. But not having that was painful. And then I found my old phone, which was an iPhone 12. And the battery life of an iPhone 12 is just hideous compared to modern phone. It's just
Yeah. But
unbelievable.
at least you
You
had
don't
one.
realize it until you go back.
We get all these press releases about the secondary market for phones and all that sort of thing. But whenever I upgrade, I always hold on to my old phone for precisely that
Yep,
circumstance of
yep,
just something
exactly.
to fall back on. And that's well worth not realizing the probably
In case you
tens
cook
of
it,
pounds that I'd get. You what?
in case you cook it with your Christmas dinner.
In case I do an Ian and I stick it in with the spuds and the parsnips at Christmas, or do what I
Tell me
did.
that's a gag and no, and that didn't happen. Did it
That
happen?
did happen. It did
That did
happen.
happen. Yeah.
Man, your
And he,
oven must have smelled toasty that year.
Well, the first he knew about it was them going, these spuds taste a bit fucking weird. Yeah, they taste of iPhone. Um, and then we had
Or
the time
iPhone.
one time when I was late at night, probably been out with Ian, fairly mashed, sitting there at
Oh,
St Pancras station waiting for my train, listening to a podcast, and I got on the train. And then suddenly, after about a minute, the podcast, no, not after probably 10 seconds, the podcast just cut out. And I was like, oh, what's going on? Why is the connection busted? I was like, oh, yeah, it's because my phone's still
wasn't
on that
that
bench in St Pancras station.
bad.
And so then I got to the next station along, jumped out, waited for the next one back in, got there, and by that time, someone had already made off with it. So,
Yeah,
what you got to
unfortunately.
do?
Um,
But yeah, I mean, another thing, by the way, but talking about the reliance, while we're on this reliance on phones tangent, it's like, how many phone numbers do you now memorize? I can still remember my number from when I was a kid at home. I mean, it's so long ago that I'm a Londoner that it starts 01. And I can still remember that, but I can barely remember my own number, let alone, and certainly not anyone else's. So you lose
the
your
only,
phone and all that's gone.
the only number I know is my wife's number because she's had it for like 20 years.
Yeah.
That's the only number my own number and her number. That's about it.
Mm.
Uh,
So that's another
I know
way in
my
which we're
parents'
reliant.
next line. That's it.
and actually, occasionally I get the last three digits. It's like I think it's 663, and sometimes I do 633. And I
Yeah.
phone this other person so often they know it's me to say, "Oh, you got the number wrong again."
And then we're all using instant messaging, which, as we found out in the news this week, sometimes you end up including people on those messages you didn't intend to. So that's
Indeed.
yeah. I mean, what a better illustration. I certainly don't want to drill down into that for people who don't know what I'm obliquely referring to. It's this story coming out of the States about some classified information journalist being looped in on a signal group. But what a great illustration of how even all the way to the top, how reliant we are on these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot went wrong on that, but ultimately
Yeah.
we've all seen it. We've been sent a message, and it's like, oh, who's this? And I always reply with Batman when that happens. But it's it's so easily done, which is why in certain arenas you've got a process because it is easily done. But yeah, I mean, I think, and also it's so easy. We made it easy for people to communicate, which is something I'm super proud of, actually. But yeah, I mean, you need, in terms of business and industry and government, you need to have the right setups and processes. And again, that's another use case for private 5G. That I saw at MWC, which was 5G on the battlefield. I
Yeah.
mean,
No, that came up a lot.
it's kind of a sad use of the technology, but it's a reality, and being able to effectively parachute a mobile network in a container is something that quite a lot of countries have been looking at as
I
a
know
way.
it's really impressive, and Nokia's going big on that. Were you ever on a pod with my former colleague Jamie Davis, Neil?
No, I was not.
Oh, right.
No.
Oh, so he used to be deputy editor, and then he went off to Vodafone to work on the PR side, and
Yeah,
now
I
he's
do
at
know.
Nokia.
I know him, but I don't think
Yeah.
I've dealt with him.
Well, Ian shared a story with me earlier on this week. Is it in Nikkei or something? And
Yeah.
and they're talking about this sort of more military applications. And there's a photo of Jamie with a great big backpack on, with antennas sprouting out of
Yeah.
it. So
Yeah.
he's famous now that he's there. He's like
Well,
rogue
that
trooper
seems
or
to
something.
be one of the big growth areas for Nokia at the moment on the mobile side is to sort of go after this military stuff. And I
Talk
noticed
about being in the right place at the right time, eh? With all the extra spending going on.
yeah, well, I noticed one of the Nvidia announcements that came out recently. One of its latest sort of AI RAN pitches was very much about 6G from a kind of military point of view, and there was a there was a military. They resist being called a military think tank, but there was a sort of military, because they wrote to me and complained about it after I published the story. But they
What were they
basically,
called?
I can't remember the top of my head, but
I think I know the one. Yeah.
they're involved in the kind of mix, and also this company that's doing RAN software in the US, where I think the guy who runs it is actually the Deputy Secretary of Defense. I mean, they don't seem to mind these days having politicians who also have massive private sector interests, do they? It seems
Indeed.
to be seems to be okay now that Musk has set the kind of precedent for that. So,
Although to be pedantic, Musk isn't a politician; he's like an advisor or something.
well, yeah, he's like Rasputin, isn't he?
There we go. Yes.
I've now got that
No,
song in my head.
what Boney M.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one
Showing
of
our
my
age.
karaoke favorites.
Showing our age, invoking a bit of Boney M. Um,
But
what was I going
I
to
thought it was
say?
interesting with all this. I don't know if we're going to talk about 6G at some point, but
Yeah, we certainly will. I mean, yeah,
the
let's pop in it briefly because I had one or two direct follow-ups on what Neil was talking about, but then we can go there. Just on that ubiquitous connectivity thing, and I completely agree. And as you rightly say, a lot of applications can't tolerate patchy connectivity. You'd rather not go there than be periodically disappointed by being out of connectivity.
Yeah,
But I just still think the billing model, the revenue generation model for operators. So they keep providing better and better connectivity services and more bandwidth and more coverage and all that sort of thing. But it's very difficult for them to charge a premium for it. And obviously that would be something that you would have thought about, especially in your previous job, I would have thought.
yeah. I
What are
mean,
your thoughts about that?
so look, if I was to say, hey, if you pay another £5 a month, any kind of Wi-Fi network that's in vicinity, suddenly you can use it so that you've got coverage. I can tell you right now, I'd cough the money up, personally speaking.
Yeah.
Not everybody would,
You just got
but
to
I
sell
think
it properly to a normie, haven't you? Because
yeah,
in the most respectful way possible, Neil, you're not a normie, you're an early adopter.
100%. I mean, look, I think I, my take on this is, we've um, we've made access to the network. We've tried to make it as accessible as we possibly can. I do think we're at a place where that's becoming harder, especially in, some difficult to build locations where it's hard to build infrastructure or it's expensive or perhaps the return isn't there. And I do feel that, and I think, I think a few other people have kind of wrote this where, actually is putting the price up for some of these or adding kind of bolt-ons as we used to call them, is that a viable way to pay for some of this? We've kind of got, the obvious one that we've got on that is roaming right now. That's, effectively, so I go to the US a lot and my bill for roaming is always insanely high, even though I try to use Wi-Fi as much as possible, but it's too manual. Um,
Yes, exactly.
Look, I think the kind of MNO of the future thinks way beyond its own infrastructure. And I think the first MNOs that do that try to focus on how do we use all the infrastructure that's out there, and how do we make that equitable for all the operators of that infrastructure. I think that they'll be onto a winner because even in the best will of the world, and every stadium, you're not going to get four operators building infrastructure and Wi-Fi and some CCTV network. And, I just feel that over time, that's a problem that customers and consumers are going to demand it. I mean, I've got a 6-year-old grandson that just doesn't get it, that when he's in the car, YouTube doesn't work. And
Yeah,
that generation, I just don't think are going to accept it, and we need to solve that problem. And what's frustrating for me is it is solvable. Um, but I'll flip back to this. Where are the operators now? There's still these huge infrastructures that are mostly manually run. They've got loads of people trying to run it. And doing that isn't adding any more value for them. So and this was a strategy I positioned at BT, and I've talked to many other service providers who have got a similar strategy, which is that bottom core infrastructure, the 5G, the fiber, the things that get people connected. I want to have that as automated as I possibly can, literally so that there's a handful of people are running it. And then I want to take all that engineering knowledge and skills to put it at the front of working with customers to solve connectivity and technology problems. You know, we see, and I'll point at SoftBank as a organization that's trying to do that very aggressively and being successful, experimenting. So some things work, some things don't.
Mm.
But if you imagine, you know, if I think in my old place at BT, imagine, you know, in Howard's team, there must be about 9 or 10,000 people. Imagine if I was able to automate the core of what they did, and suddenly 9,000 people became available to work with customers that can enable some of the challenges that we've talked about, that why 5G wasn't successful. I genuinely believe that, you know, someone who runs a supermarket knows nothing about the network. Someone who runs a network knows nothing about a supermarket. You've got to have those people come together to get the most out of what they
Fair
need,
enough.
what the network can solve. So I think that I think service providers who aren't thinking about that, and vendors too, we need to figure out how do we solve some of these. And actually, again, at Juniper, we've worked on a couple of these control plane apps that allow you to do that and also connect to multiple clouds, etc. How do you do that in a way that increases connectivity where there's already connectivity there? And you know that I think from a mobile operator and any kind of service provider, you know, there's a mindset change, which is, you know, the mindset, you know, and I'm guilty of this because I was part of it, was we've got to own everything. That's just
Mm.
not realistic anymore.
Yeah. Ian, when you were talking about those people who didn't like you calling them a defense aligned or whatever, can you remember who they were?
I can find out.
Oh no, because I just it rang a bell with me. I was writing about Nvidia stuff, something we spoke about last week at the end of the one with David Hunt, and um, and I had to look up this one company. I'd never heard of them, but
They're called
Nvidia.
NITA.
Yeah, exactly. So those are the ones. So how did I describe them? I said the most telecoms announcement of the 19 press releases Nvidia spammed out on day one was one titled Nvidia and telecom industry leaders to develop AI native wireless networks for 6G. And then I said those leaders. And then I said, sarkily, are there any industry followers in brackets? Because it's such an overused term, isn't it? Leaders. No, we're just an also ran. We're just making up our numbers. In this case, are T-Mobile and Cisco. And I said the other companies named are US defense aligned R&D Quango MITRE,
Yeah,
management consultant Booz Allen Hamilton, because you wrote a great big piece on this as well. And
yeah.
I feel a bit of FOMO. I mean, defense aligned R&D Quango, I would have thought they'd find quite offensive, but they haven't complained at all. So
Yeah,
it shows how much less relevant I am.
well, I don't think my thing was really about the NVIDIA 6G stuff
Oh,
specifically
okay.
to do with military, but that was like a news hook for it. I think there's a company called it's the ORAN Development Company,
That's
which
right.
I think,
They're in there as well.
but they're like
ODC to its
they're
mates.
like a DU software company. But I think the CEO is like the Deputy Secretary of Defense
Yeah, and
as
they're
well.
owned by a hedge fund. I don't know. I just thought it was interesting. There was lots of sort of. I don't want to be sort of slanderous, but there were lots of like different, slightly shifty incentives and interests suddenly coming into this group from
Yeah,
Quangos and hedge fund owned this, that, and the other, and management consultants and all that sort of thing. I just thought, what a weird motley collection of people to get together.
yeah, and it's not really. I mean, the 6G stuff's a bit opportunistic anyway. I think it's just throwing out the label, isn't it? Because this is what people used to do when they only had 4G, and it seemed like a good idea to get a head start on everybody who was yet to launch 5G.
Yeah.
So the 5G service, just because it was a slightly faster service, but it was
And
actually
that's when you don't shackle the marketing people sufficiently. Well, let's go there. We a couple of times we've said we're going to talk about 6G, and you've just given another segue. So let's go there on that one.
I've been doing a load of false starts with 6G. Yeah,
Well, exactly. So I thought, yes, appropriately enough.
well, like one of those 100-meter runners who gets disqualified very quickly.
Yeah, exactly. What was I going to say? So, yeah, like reading, you've written something, and then Robert Clark has written something this week, and they're both very interesting, and they're consistent with some of the conversations I've been having recently on the matter.
Yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time asking people at MWC about it because I think the
Right.
NGMN, there's a group called the NGMN Alliance that Neil will be well aware of, which is like a club of telcos, club of very big telcos. I mean, it's most of the big European names, and I think NTT Docomo's in it. I think T-Mobile's in it. Not sure about AT&T and Verizon. It's got a perception of being more sort of European and Asian group, but it does have T-Mobile in there, I think, on both sides of the pond as a kind of figure in it. And they've been, I think at the moment their chairman is Laurent Leboucher at Orange. I think he's just become
Yeah, he's
chairman.
just taken over. He's just taken over.
Yeah, he's just so I chatted to him quite a bit about 6G in the past and asked him about 6G at the show. I asked Howard about it. I asked Jeannie York from VMO2, just sort of get a sort of sense of operators thinking. And it's pretty consistent with what the messaging has been in NGMN white papers over the last sort of year and a half, 2 years, which is we don't really want a big forklift swap. You know, we don't want, and it's what Neil came in talking about right at the beginning, that there's a bit of disappointment about 5G. I think there's maybe a sense that 5G still hasn't really happened in some ways. You know, some of the use cases that were talked about and some of the whizzier stuff that we'd like to see is still yet to come, even though we're kind of 5 years or whatever into rollout. And people don't want to be talking about another generation of technology when they've not really monetized the first one and not made the returns that they wanted. So I think on the telco side, that's where the messaging has come from. The question is whether the vendors are going to hear the message or just try and carry on doing their 10-year cycle. Here's a bunch of new boxes that you need to go and buy at great expense. And I thought the last Ericsson call on this was really interesting in January, the earnings call, when you had the CEO coming out and saying 6G is an evolution of 5G. You know, you need to get your 5G network deployed, and these cycles are over now. You know, we're not going to see these peaks.
Right, which is a hell of an admission for Ericsson to make.
We're not going to see the peaks and troughs of investment anymore. We're going to have to become more software based. I mean, the idea of the vendors becoming more software based has been around for a long time, but to kind of be that stark about it, that they need to sort of move to a different approach, and is very telling, I think. And Howard Watson was saying to me at MWC that he senses that the big vendors have taken the message on board and kind of listened to it. And then you had this big session in South Korea that happened immediately after Mobile World Congress, where there was a lot of working groups and an effort to find some kind of agreement on some of these big 6G themes. And you know, everybody kind of puts their heads together. And
so this was a 3GPP thing, wasn't it?
3GPP working. There's a bunch of these that lead up to the actual development of the technology, and this was kind of a fairly big one in terms of trying to coordinate things. And the story that Robert wrote, which went up today on our website, I thought was really good, where he'd sort of looked at what the messaging was coming out of that, and very much about not overcomplicating it. I think with 5G, there was a sense, various people have said this to me, that there was a lot included that hasn't been used. There were too many options almost, and overcomplication. They want to try and get away from that. And they don't. And this idea that it should be as software upgradable as possible. You don't have to take out everything that you've just spent a lot of money kind of introducing. You can do it on a more piecemeal basis, and maybe looking at specific areas where you might want some capability that you aren't getting from 5G, but not going around the whole network and taking the whole thing out and bringing in a new set of infrastructure is very kind of relevant. Some of the things seem to have been ditched as well. Some of the stuff that there was talk of, like the use of terahertz, there was not much attention. I've always thought that, to me, sounded a bit wildly optimistic anyway, that you could ever hope to get much use out of, given what sort of happened with millimeter wave. And but it's not really, you know, I mean, Verizon made a big deal of millimeter wave spectrum, didn't they, years ago? Is like
and that went nowhere, didn't it?
It's gone nowhere, really. And I thought the idea of pushing it up to kind of terahertz levels was like, where's it really going to be?
Well, we used to joke that with millimeter wave, you've got to be sat on a base station. With terahertz, you've probably got to eat a base station.
Yeah, exactly. And then there were these reflective surfaces. I think there wasn't much attention paid to that. This idea, you know, that you can it's almost like sort of beam forming on steroids, it seems. But the equipment, it sounded like it'd have to be so expensive that you're putting in place, and there's all these problems with other buildings that might kind of interfere with it, and where you install it.
It might not be reflective.
To have got away from that. I think the things that are still in the mix, you know, other than other than kind of moving the standard on and doing some of the basic stuff that you would do in terms of souping up speeds and improving latency and just basically moving the technology along, which happens with ordinary releases anyway. I think you see those kinds of things happening. Is this talk of integrated sensing and communication? That seems to be the one thing that maybe is a little bit of a game changer, but I don't get the sense there's agreement on how that would happen or what kind of changes have to happen at the network level yet to make that possible. But it's this idea that you've been at interdigital things where they make a big deal about this, Scott. Idea that the network becomes, like has a sort of bat-like power to kind of figure out the shape of things.
Sort of a radar / sonar type of vision. I mean, this is something that leads on to something I was going to ask, and I'll ask Neil about this. I was chatting to another senior person on the like the CTO side of things at an operator this week, but I won't name them because it wasn't on the record. And they were talking about a sense that 5G was very much engineer driven. So you had all the clever boffins. They came up with some new technologies. They went, here you go, now try and flog it. And in this particular case, it proved difficult to flog, even though I'm sure some of the technological advances were quite significant. And this person I was chatting to was expressing a fear that they try that same thing with 6G, where again the boffins go into their little sorcerer's apprentice dungeon, come out with dodge all the animated broomsticks and come out with something clever, and then go to the commercial world, right? Flog that. So yeah, just wondering, Neil, what you think of that, the sort of engineering first as opposed to business case first argument.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't believe that's what happened in 5G. Actually, what I think happened in 5G is there was kind of a push to have something new to sell from businesses.
Yeah.
Sold all the 4G we're going to sell. We need something new. And
an upgrade cycle.
Yeah, and that drove 5G. But actually, look, there was also a push to do 5G quickly. And this is why we ended up with this NSA SA.
Yes, exactly.
I genuinely
Which is a real fudge.
I genuinely believe, looking back at that was a massive mistake for the industry.
I agree. And it's because we decided to stick with this 10-year cadence, whereas if they'd just gone, let's make this one a 15-year job, that might have been different.
Yeah, but also let's understand how we do things slightly more incrementally as well. This big bang, I've done two big bangs, 4G and 5G. Honestly, it's such an effort.
Well, that's one of the messages coming out of South Korea, Neil, actually, and I think AT&T was even saying, I think they were quoted in Robert's story, like this idea of continuous, CICD, continuous innovation, continuous development, rather than this, like, let's look at 10 years time, what we need and work towards that, which is the old-fashioned standardization way of doing things, but maybe just isn't really appropriate anymore.
Yeah, I mean, look at, I'll give an example of that. Look at Teams or Zoom. Every day there's a new feature. They didn't have some big party and create a logo to say, hey, it's Zoom version 10, right? They just put it out there, right? So I think there's stuff to learn from that. I mean, my nervousness about, so I have a t-shirt that a great friend of mine, Chris, gave me, which was no more G's. And he gave it to me the day after we launched 5G. And I was like, yep, I'll buy into that. And I think I've gone on record that I think more G's are going to be more challenging.
And I think your former colleague Howard has said that. Ian quite often quotes him.
Yeah. And I think that, but there is an upside to the G discussion, which is if I have a phone that says it's 5G, I know it's going to work on a 5G network. And I think fragmenting the capabilities, we need to think carefully about the customer in that cycle time. So, again, we're not the norm. I know what I'm buying, or I know what I want to get, but I want to be certain that my wife or my daughter, who aren't technical people, they want to go buy a phone, they know that it's going to work and it's going to have the right capabilities. So I think there's some, I think it's a fixable thing, but I think there's something that we need to consider on, the customers that ultimately pay for this. What do they think about it, right? But, and once we understand that, okay, how do we plug that in? And actually, that's probably where the 5G NSA started, because actually most people at the time, 4G worked for them really well. I don't need
Yeah,
5G. Um,
certainly with mobile broadband, it's
yeah,
largely
and that was
sufficient.
definitely a debate that happened. And also, at least here in the UK, we had 3.5 gigahertz as the deployment spectrum, which frankly is terrible for going through buildings. So, in the initial deployment in big metros, it was really difficult to tune it to make it work as well as people would expect it to. So, I think there's something in a more incremental path. I think, and if we moved, and this is where I'm kind of in two minds about this, because we have this technical, there's a strategy where, hey, we'll just use generic compute and it'll all be software. And, in my experience, that tends to lead to not the most efficient approach to doing things versus dedicated silicon or dedicated capability that does something really well. And there's a paper that MIT published, I want to say 2, maybe 3 years ago, about many silicon technologies were starting to hit a kind of a real hard ceiling on being able to continually add processing power. We've added more cores, we've added more memory, we've done this, we've done that, we've done this, and the whole
Smaller
architecture,
processes. Yeah.
yeah, the whole architecture has moved forward. But their paper stated that's going to be harder, and that might mean challenges. So when you look at development systems like Python, it's a programming language where a lot of stuff's written. Python relies upon a faster, more powerful CPU year after year after year. And if you don't get it, Python becomes challenged, right? So in that world of generic CPU, and of course, I'm sure those that sell those have got a plan and they've got some great ideas to fix it. But if I believe what this paper says, then actually, do we move to a world where there, we're more specific about electronics and technology to the use case? Historically, that's always been something that I've paid a lot of attention to in building networks and building infrastructure, because I've seen software-based solutions just not cut it, whereas hardware-based solutions are. And it's finding the right solution for the right use case. But in my mind, you know, we have got to a place where it's definitely you can deploy high scale solutions with all the technology the cloud guys have given us with Kubernetes and scale out, etc. That it's definitely possible to build a solution that works like that. But my kind of nervousness is that where the industry is, and I flip back to the rollout of 5G, where one of the 5G standards decided, hey, you're going to run this on a cloud infrastructure, where most telcos didn't have a cloud infrastructure to run it. And that was another one of the things that took some time to get up and running. Are the operators of these networks, are the ways that the people who build this network, are they able to actually swallow that type of technology change? I
Mm.
would say yes, but I think they have to lead it, and they have to lead it based on demand. There is a demand for this, so we're going to build this and we're going to roll it out and we're going to have these capabilities. I think you know, where we have a brochure for the 5G logo that says we'll have robotic doctors. And and I was like, as a patient, robotic doctors doesn't sound too exciting to me.
Count me out.
That's the kind of, okay, I'm using a really grotesque example of some of the.
Yeah, but it does come up a lot.
Absolutely, and all, robotic cars, self-flying planes, and stuff like that. You just think, who's getting on that plane? So I just, I feel that we need to figure out, how do we make this more, user-centric around building the networks and the capabilities in the network that delivers what they need and delivers it well. And I think with 5G, we just totally missed that entirely.
Yeah.
And I don't think that was boffins going into a room and trying to come up with crazy ideas. I mean, of course, there was some of that. But also, when we've had this discussion before, I think if you don't have the crazy idea, it doesn't inspire you to have the idea that suddenly, oh, wait a minute, this is giving me this idea. So there's not, there's never a bad idea, but it's how do we get, how do we understand that, Fred, who's got this problem that with a few tweaks in the network, we could just solve it. How do we create that feedback loop? And I genuinely think that's all about. I really go back to the coverage point. How do we make sure everyone's connected all of the time? Because I think when that happens, you start to solve these problems because you can depend upon the network being there, and the network being able to give the value that that user needs to have. So that's kind of how I see 6G. I mean, look, I think having seen the numbers, having worked for an operator and seen the numbers, I can I totally sympathize why they're concerned about another big rollout because it's just not it just doesn't work for them.
Yeah.
But then I look at I'm in the vendor industry now, in the vendor community, which I always tell people is a different part of the same value chain. What does that mean for us? And I want to talk a little bit about something that I heard a lot of MWC, which was network modernization. How do you go from a world of keeping a network, modern, secure, sustainable, capable, and performant, such that you've always got a network that's right for the demands. And I think these two things are linked. And again, even in the fixed network, telcos typically work on cycles. We build a network, it goes end of life. We build a new network, it goes end of life. I think over time that starts to become a bit more fuzzy. I still think there's points in time where we will have to change the underlying hardware because things improve, things get better, processing power becomes more, just gets even more capable and it uses less energy. So I think there'll always be a cycle of upgrades, but I think we need to decouple the features that customers use from that cycle of upgrades. And I think on the
Yeah,
fixed,
that makes a lot of sense.
I think
Yeah, I think that's.
Go on, Ian.
I think that's the. Totally agree with everything Neil said, by the way. But I think that almost the danger of one thing that's going on at the moment is there's almost too much, like a lack of vision of what 6G could be. You don't want somebody saying, you need to go and replace your whole network and it's going to cost you this. And by the way, there's no obvious business case for it. Of course you don't.
But just do it anyway because it's time.
I almost feel it's swung back the other way too much a little bit, where there isn't really a vision and there's a danger that we don't innovate. And I think we came in at the start talking a bit about China and sort of we don't really. China's become a lot more secretive. I think one of the things that's happened as a result of what's going on politically at the moment and some of the stuff that happened with Huawei is that we don't really know as much about China as we used to. We used to have, I feel I used to have a better sort of sight of what Huawei was doing because he used to do press conferences. Used to chat to them. I don't really know what they're up to these days, but
I mean, absolutely. You'd have telcos from Europe going to see them once a year, so you kind of knew, you'd have your what we call EBC, and you'd learn about what you're doing. But also, there's a flip side to that. They don't understand as much about what the demand is because they're not having those sessions with their customers that they once had. So I think there's an equal part of this. But I look to China and the scale of it. At some point in time, those vendors that make, 5G kit, there's no more 5G kit to sell. We've done it all. It's there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, we'll just close the shop and go home. Of course, they're not going to do that. They're going to say, well, what you need is 5G plus version 12 or 6G or whatever the next thing is.
Yeah.
They're going to want to have that. And I think, and actually not just in the Chinese market, I think in other markets. But I think probably Korea's the other market I would kind of put there, and they've got Samsung clearly that's a big player there. So I can't help but feel that if we don't figure out quickly what that vision is, Ian, we're in very big danger of repeating former mistakes.
Yeah, and I think the
we can't
apathy
afford
about
that.
the apathy about 5G and oh, it's not really worked out. And there's a lot of talk at the moment about this. I mean, this is one thing that William Webb goes on about a lot, and I'm not saying he's wrong, by the way. But this idea of a traffic slowdown, and I mean, yeah, okay, that is happening, and there are people who'd hit back at that and say, well, yeah, but the numbers are much bigger, so even a small percentage is actually quite a bit of growth anyway. Is one pushback, but it doesn't mean it's always going to be the way. I mean, we don't really know what's going to happen in 5 years' time. We could be in a situation where if you do like stop innovating and China is innovating, then all of a sudden you've got a big kind of lag. And we talk a lot about bifurcation and two systems emerging. I don't know if that's going to happen at the standards level. I mean, there's speculation about and a lot of people think that won't happen, but certainly we could be in a sort of more of a sort of two-track vendor world, and you wouldn't want. I don't know. I just feel that there needs to be some kind of vision of where things go. One group of people I talked to a little bit about this on the other side. This was raised in the NGMN paper, actually, the last one, about the talk of a new air interface and a new core, the sort of fundamental features of the of any standard, and the idea that there should be a new air interface usually gets quite a lot of pushback, I think, from telcos, because that's something that would necessitate big changes. But our friends Scott at Cohere, they're very much involved in this.
I know. I'm just reminding myself that, just to tell our audience, you wrote a piece this week called "6G Apathy Outside of China is Rife," and you quote Cohere in that.
Work on developing is not specific to Cohere, but they do have patents in it. But there are Chinese companies filing patents in this area as well. It's called OTFS, I think, which I think is orthogonal time frequency space. So it would be a potential successor to the kind of 4G and 5G OFDM based.
I don't even know what orthogonal means, by the way, but it sounds very.
You can ask Neil about that. Don't ask me to explain things like that.
I wouldn't know an orthogon if you slapped me in the arse with it.
Their view is, because I think they realize themselves that people don't want to have this idea that, you should take out all. By the way, the guys who run Cohere are a small company, but attracts quite a lot of interest because companies like Vodafone have put it through its paces and said the USM stuff they have, which is taking a bit of OTFS and applying that to boost capacity basically on networks, and it has a kind of play in the Open RAN world to some extent, but companies like Vodafone that have put through that through its paces say it works really well, and it's really interesting, and the guys that run it, who we've had on the podcast before, Ray Dolan, he was formerly someone involved with a company called Flareon that sold itself to Qualcomm for quite a lot of money, and the stuff they were doing there became quite important in terms of Qualcomm's position in OFDM. So they're kind of worth listening to, those guys. I mean, they obviously have their pitch and their message, and they're trying to sell themselves, but they do know what they're talking about. And they're not sort of suggesting that you take out all OFDM-based systems and suddenly switch to this OTFS thing instead. But they do make the interesting point that if we've got technologies that are coming along that have advantages in certain scenarios, then we don't want to close the door on them and just go, hey, we're not really interested. You need to keep innovating.
I agree. I mean, I think this is why I get kind of I get frustrated with our industry, where we jump on bandwagons that are they really going to deliver value? And I'll call my favorite one NFV. I just the bandwagon for that, and
where did that go?
And I mean, it's translated into cloud, but it's come from the cloud players because they knew what they were doing, and frankly, we didn't. And we had a team actually sponsored it at BT to work on this, but what we learned very quickly is this is complicated and hard. But also the things that we felt it was going to solve, it actually didn't solve them. So when I hear about something, like using a different modulation technique that could be more efficient, then I'm excited about that, because that's easy. It's really easy. You can measure it, you can do the math on it, you can do the cost, you can do the impact. And I kind of feel that I wish that we focused on things more like that more often. I give another example. Hollow core fiber, pretty much invented in Southampton University.
That's right. I remember writing about that.
Luminicity developed it. I actually worked with them as an advisor. Great capability. Microsoft acquired the company, and this week put out an announcement that they're rolling this new type of fiber out into their data centers, which it gives them more capacity and reduces latency. That's the sort of things that customers just they get it right away. Whereas NFV, like no one cares. I don't have a customer that ever phoned me up and said, "Hey Neil, I'm buying BT because you're running NFV." Just it's just like what? So
Mm.
and I kind of feel that um that sort of vision and leadership is something that we need more and more of. And if I put my Juniper hat on for a minute, we're pushing that innovation through automation and AI. That's where we see being taking all the capabilities we've got, our more effective silicon, our more efficient silicon, and using AI to get the most out of it. It's just there's other vendors that have got similar or pushing down other visions, but what I don't see enough of is from the operator community that says our customers need this, which means we need that. When can we have it? And that it feels to me like that last cycle in the chain
Mm.
uh, we've kind of lost sight of, and I feel we 100% need to get that back so that if this technology that Cohere's got, and they're, by all accounts, having read some of their papers, they're a very knowledgeable organization. Is that something that actually maybe as an industry we need to take more of a look at? And I look at hollow core fiber where, and anyone can build that. It's not it's literally a fiber with air in the middle. I say anyone can build it. It's quite difficult, but Microsoft have got a massive advantage in their data centers over everybody else because they've kind of taken that and seen the value of it. I feel that we need to get back to that sort of thinking, and then at some point in time you standardize it. I was at an event where we were talking about when's the right time to standardize things, and quite often we kind of standardize to such a lowest common denominator, the value gets evaporated. So I would definitely I would, as much as, you know, there's probably parts of different vendors and different organizations, different telcos that have got, well, we've invested in this. We don't want to lose that investment. Obviously, it's going to be additive, not to as many industries and sectors in the telecoms industry, so that we can build upon it. But I do feel that true innovation in radio has kind of taken a back seat to Open RAN and making it standardized. When I feel that we've got a lot more. I talk about. I'll give an example that just drove me nuts. We were one of the pinball events. We were trying to live stream it. We're in a shopping mall. All four networks in the UK. I couldn't get 3 megabits per second consistently. Um, why aren't we fixing that problem? What's
Yeah.
the technology opportunity to fix an issue like that? Because I can't believe I'm the only person
Yeah.
that.
And it can't be beyond the capabilities of all the boffins to fix it if only it's prioritized.
And
Yeah.
but there's a community out there that's shouting for this, and I don't feel people are listening to them. And
So that comes back to the customer centric thing, doesn't it?
100%. I'm fearful that we have to get much more embedded with our customers. We have to take more of our engineering community and put it with the users of the network to figure this stuff out so that we can have the vision that you're talking about, Ian.
Yeah, I think the NFV side of things, and you were talking about general purpose silicon and stuff like that earlier. It's all a bit depressing, isn't it, really? Because it's just a kind of like we're struggling to do things in our sector. Let's try and leverage what somebody else has done somewhere else and tap into the scale economies there. But then there's a trade-off, which is, I mean, this is always the point that gets made about cloud RAN and virtual RAN, which is kind of a subset of that open RAN thing. I mean, to me, it's a
Yeah.
bit different, but this idea that you piggyback on the IT sector's general purpose processes that are used for all sorts of other things, and then we don't have to worry about developing our own silicon. And okay, it's not quite as good, but there'll be some efficiencies to realize from it. It's quite I don't know, to me it's a bit of a depressing message, really, isn't it? I'd rather hear people talk about things like hollow core fiber and stuff that's actually new in the sector itself and doing something interesting.
Rather than leaning on other bigger, more buoyant sectors.
This is the thing, right? I mean, I kind of, and I always kind of think of COVID at this time for how popular and how important the network became. We've lost, I believe, and I used to bang this drum. In fact, I still bang it everywhere I go, which is how do we make the network feel like to a consumer of it that it's something that's important to them, that's valuable to them. Most people, the network isn't the important thing, it's the app that they're doing, which I kind of get. And because of that, the value of the network is depressed, and you can buy for £10 a month, you can buy as much bandwidth as, a
Yeah.
million pound a year used to cost you 20 years ago, right? How do we get back to that world where we really see that value such that when we want to invest in things, we're not talking about it from a cost out perspective. We're talking about it from a capability in. We're trying to create these new things, and
And that's
too
where you
often,
start to be able to charge some kind of premium. Yeah.
hopefully, but even just stopping the leakage.
Yes. First things
Imagine
first.
you just get to that point, right? How valuable would that be? And this is the challenge. This is why, I think a lot of operators look to 5G SA to say, and as probably a stepping stone to 6G, I suspect. But how are we really taking that and creating something of value to users? But how are we doing it so that it's everywhere? Because I genuinely believe that just picking 10 cities and saying, hey, we've got 5 GSA here. I don't think that's going to cut it anymore. I really don't. I know, and that's a hard message for network operators to swallow. But I just look at the how people are using the network and how the network's being developed. I just feel that that's it, and I really feel that and this is something that telcos used to do really well back in the day, which was they had an R&D department that was seen as a valuable part of the business that was creating capabilities. Now, I'm not saying that we go back and, AT&T or BT or anyone starts making their own box and with the logo on it, but I do feel that there's a mid ground there, where there's capabilities they could create, on a platform like Telco Cloud, like the hyperscalers have done. They've got a great delivery platform. They can roll out apps really quickly, and that was part of BT Network Cloud when I was there, which is how do we have that capability? So if we have some great ideas, we can get them to market quickly, because one of the biggest challenges we face, how did telcos 20 years ago, how did you get something to market? You put a bit of data fill in the telephone switch and bang, everybody had it. How do telcos get to that world where they
Yeah.
can really push out these services, but make them available to all the folks that use them? Because scale, it turns out, is one of the most important things in our industry.
One
Neil, it's a
thing.
bit.
Yeah, go on.
I was just going to. This is again a bit of a tangent, but you were earlier on. You were talking about the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum and not being great for sort of in-building coverage. I'm just wondering if you see, with standalone being rolled out, and it seems like they're pushing it into lower spectrum bands, and we've got 3G
Yeah.
getting shut down, and that's becoming available. Do you see that? I mean, one thing I'd quite like to do, because I'm a BT customer on my mobile, and I don't have a standalone compatible phone, but I understand from the BT guys that there are quite a lot of handsets now that are sort of supported, including the latest Apple one. Again, this is another reason to get a 16, I suppose. But do you see that making quite a difference? I mean, not just in the UK, but like changing things quite a lot 5G wise in terms of availability.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look at T-Mobile as an example, right? They had a very different 5G strategy from all the other US operators, and they've kind of gone from, and no disrespect intended, but whenever I'd be roaming to the US, if I was on T-Mobile, the first thing I'd do would be to move, because I just knew the quality wasn't there. Now it's the other way around. They've gone, and this isn't, they've obviously got an SA network as well, but even on their non-standalone, they've gone down to have much more low frequency spectrum, as opposed to the 3 gigahertz and even the millimeter wave that was out there. And I think it's paid dividends for them, because all of a sudden you can get a signal in many places you couldn't before. And you look at, I remember, it used to be this WI event held in the US every year, wireless innovation event. I forget the name of the company that ran it, but this was a mega event in the wireless industry, where the good and the great were at. You'd have CEOs of big corporations there, and I got invited to talk about 5G, which gave me a heart attack, because I'm thinking, oh my God, how am I going to talk to all these people? But
Mm.
on before me was the CMO of T-Mobile. And they basically talked about, we're going for a kind of mid to low band strategy because we think this is going to give a much improved experience. And there was two things. I was like, why is he telling everyone this? Because I would want to keep this a secret to start with. But then I realized actually it's too late for any of the other guys to react. And I look at what's happened to T-Mobile over the last couple of years. They've just exploded as an operator. And I think it is because they are able to connect people in more locations. Yeah, Verizon and AT&T are catching up, of course, but I do feel that the more coverage or connection that you've got, the more business it drives your way. So I think SA is I think a lot of operators are looking at the 2100 UMTS band to become the kind of band for SA. I think that's definitely going to help 5G perception. Um, is it is it enough? Do we need more lower band spectrum? I'd say yes. But we also need to ensure that of the spectrum assets that are there, that we use the kind of right ones for the right topic. So one example, I strongly believe that delivering mobile broadband over a 5G network is madness, especially if it's fixed wireless access. I just don't think that's a great use of spectrum on the 5G network because it's expensive. There are other solutions that are fixed wireless access that don't have all the overhead of 5G that are, kind of simple point-to-point stuff that are much more cost effective and can provide a better service. But typically it's, people with a hotspot trying to make it work, and that just doesn't scale well. So, you
Even
know,
4G, Neil.
even in 4G,
Right.
yeah, I would say so because look, you've got all these things like this that, the mobile network, the clues in the title, mobile, it's designed for stuff that moves. And if
Mm.
you're just lugging a load of bandwidth between point A and point B, you got a whole load of, you've got the MMU, you've got all these other devices that are part of it. If you just look at the path that the traffic takes, it's an expensive path. So how do you offload that traffic? In a way that is sensible. And again, we see operators in the US looking at that, including T-Mobile. And I think that, enabling the spectrum for good connectivity for the right kind of technology across the board, I think is increasingly important. And if Dean was here, he'd be saying, "Yeah, this is where spectrum sharing comes in," and that's one of his topics. And some of the points he makes, I completely agree with. I think it's just how you do that in a sensible way that, again, for the user of the network, it's easy to use, and they're not having to faff about with roaming settings or anything like that. It needs to be something that just you just jump on it and it works. So I do feel that over time, that's an area of change because I think it's
Yeah.
going to have to be over time because the needs of people are going to demand it, frankly.
I'm gonna butt in, Ian, because we're nearly out of time, and there was just one more little topic that you two have provided segues to periodically that I wanted to link to, which is Open RAN. And just one last thing, one thought I've got on the conversation we were just having now is these generations. And I've said this before on the pod, and I sort of still it's a massive oversimplification, probably especially for someone like you, Neil, who understands the technological side of it far better than I do. But we understand these G's only really kicked in with 3G. And so that was turn of the millennium when there was lots of tech hype anyway, dot-com bubble and all that sort of thing. And the hype was mobile broadband in its first iteration and all the cool things you could do because it coincided with the hype around the internet. So it stood to reason that if the internet's a big deal, then being able to do the internet on a mobile device is a big deal. And then a generation later, a decade later, we had 4G, which all it really was in hindsight was mobile broadband done properly. But you
Yeah.
could see why both there was an upgrade incentive for operators and an upgrade incentive for consumers, and therefore a potential ARPU bump, because then you can get proper mobile broadband. And so, like, the first two generations were voice, the next two generations were data. And we're still at that stage of working out what the 5 and 6 generations are in an easy to define way. And maybe that's a futile quest. Maybe I'm oversimplifying too much there, but it's still a thought. That's one of the reasons why it's hard to sell and hard to get ARPU, is we're not really sure what the point of it is. And I completely agree that, we only established this 10-year cadence for about a couple of iterations. We shouldn't be wedded to it. We should move on from it. There probably will be something called 6G eventually, but it doesn't have to happen in 2030. So we definitely need to get out of that habit. But I wanted to move it on to the Open RAN thing. I want to flag up something that I wrote this week. I don't often do it. This is actually a commercial piece, in so much as the whole gig, the whole premise of me doing it was because of a partnership with the vendor Mavenir. But the reason I mention it is that I did this panel at Mobile World Congress on their stand, and it was really interesting. And I think it just yielded some pertinent, interesting stuff, regardless of the provenance of it. So it was me on a panel. You can see it on our website. I even wrote a written piece to accompany it called "A Discussion of the Current Status of the Open RAN Market." I've noticed we have a slight house style difference. Well, I knew this already, but I'm reminded of it, Ian, between Telecoms.com and Light Reading, where I capitalize the O in Open RAN and you don't.
That's enough.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I think I'm right. But anyway, at least I put a space between them. That was a bad habit we had a little while ago of joining them up. I'm not into that. Anyway.
Well, that's almost like making it a brand.
Yes, quite. And then you get into that sort of Germanic, like squeezing tons of words together into one great big word that means you win a whole game at Scrabble in one sitting. But yeah, the one of the most interesting things that came from that discussion, and it was about a 25-minute chat, so I'm not going to try and summarize it now, but one of the people on it is a chap called Rob Sonny, or Sony, I think it's Sonny, who's VP of RAN technology at AT&T. So, fairly significant player in this space. And one of the things he said when we were talking about Open RAN, so a lot of the premise of the thing was just to say, okay, what was the original promise of Open RAN, and how's it looking now? And we had another great speaker, a chap called Joe Madden, who's the founder of an analyst firm called Mobile Experts, and he was reiterating that at the start, as we all know, it was about decoupling the various components within the radio access network such that we could, in theory, mix and match different vendors and all that sort of thing. And that hasn't really turned out. I think you wrote a piece this week, Ian, where I think your headline was "Huawei ban and Open RAN failures prompt UK security concerns." And just one subsection of what you were writing was how, and we've spoken about this loads of times on the pod before, how we're moving to this single vendor Open RAN, thus apparently defeating the initial object of it, of having this vendor plurality.
Yes, that's Howard Watson.
Right, there we go. Howard Watson again.
I mean,
he's haunting you, Neil. You can't get away from the bloke.
Take it from me.
I think it's all the stuff I told him before I left. He's getting
that's it. He's just regurgitating
mileage out of it.
Take him Howard rather than me, because I've got his quote up now. He said, this is what he said in the video interview: "I do think single vendor Open RAN, which is where most of the deployments have headed, is sort of defeating the object of it. That EU, RU from different vendors doesn't seem to be making progress."
Totally. And so
what was the object of it, though?
Well, so the initial stated object, and this is something that we recap in that Mavenir thing that I was just talking about, was this sort of more pure economic purist perspective, which is that any increase in competition must therefore yield all sorts of other benefits. Obviously, driving price down, because competition does do that. So that's why we don't like monopolies. But then increasingly, and this is the interesting thing about it, and I think this is the main thing I wanted to tee up about it, other than the fact that, I think, Neil, you briefly grouped it alongside some other buzzwords that have lost their luster a little bit, and I do agree with that, is now they're talking more about, and I'll get back to Rob Sonny's quote if I can find it here. They've moved on from that. So the messaging's moved on, because that hasn't really worked, has it? It hasn't driven costs down. It hasn't delivered on some of the initial promises. And there was a political element to it. The Americans wanted to give their companies a chance to break the the duopoly that they created by banning Chinese vendors. They wanted a chance to give some Americans, such as Mavenir, a
I don't
chance to
think it
sort of
was
play the game a little bit.
American
You what?
thing. I don't think it was a specifically American thing.
But I remember there being a lot of political rhetoric coming from
I
the
think they
States
jumped on
that was
that
pro
bandwagon.
Open RAN.
Sure, but from a telco perspective, the guys that were behind it included a lot of European operators. And I think the logic was, by the way, I'm not saying I agree with the logic, but the basic logic was that in a market where you've just banned Chinese vendors, and Nokia, if you remember, wasn't in a very good position back in 2018, 2019 with its 5G strategy, it looked like you only had one real vendor in the market. After mergers of like Alcatel-Lucent and Nokia had gone through, you literally had sort of one capable non-Chinese company. So the logic was, we can't create another Ericsson from scratch because it makes like whatever it is, 15 billion a year in RAN sales and spends this much on research and development. It's like trying to create a chip company from scratch. Maybe if we open up the interfaces between these different bits of the RAN, you give some of these specialists that have always been there, but they've kind of sold through the vendor system, an opportunity to sell directly to telcos. And the telco plays a role as a systems integrator, and that's a starting point for those companies to then become bigger, and then eventually move to this world where you have various companies in these different domains of the RAN that are competitive. That was the logic that I think. But I think
well put. That's a much more comprehensive take.
Very sensible.
That was definitely the UK government's view on it as well. That perhaps there could be British companies building Open RAN stuff that would give us a foothold and back in that industry.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's all I meant by the political element. We could see that there were sort of strategic considerations.
I think to rebrand it as something like it's now about programmability, I mean, I think that's bullshit.
Right. Well, good. Well, you've just preempted the quote from Rob Sonny I was going to make. So you inadvertently offended Rob Sonny before I've even said it.
Well, that's like the business of offending AT&T.
Yeah. Well, there we are. No, we know about that. He goes, here's a quote from the panel that I did with him, and it was him and Joe Madden and BG Kumar from Mavenir. He said, and this is quotes from Rob, it's not just about TCO, total cost of ownership, that is. It's not just about supplier diversity. It really is finally about network programmability. It's about moving ourselves forward to being truly software-driven network. That's the number one objective we have to achieve. We know software-driven parts of the network have been widely successful as rapidly bringing in innovation and breaking this classic G cycle, the 10-year cycle that we often get stuck in. So that is AT&T's reframing of Open RAN. And I'll invite either of you, perhaps Ian first, as for some reason your face perpetually on my screen now, to comment on that quote.
If I'm being sympathetic towards them, then yeah, I guess there's an area of the radio access network that was never what Open RAN started off being, but it's a kind of successor to the old world of SON technology that is. I mean, Neil can talk about this more because Juniper's involved in that, and I do think that's interesting. The sort of concept of apps that run on the network, like almost like
R apps and all that,
R apps and X apps. Now they haven't really. Some of it hasn't developed as quickly as we thought. The X app side of things seems to have sort of stalled really, and it's become more of an R apps thing for various reasons. But I do think there's an opportunity there to have those as you could view that as a kind of programmable thing that wasn't there before. But I don't think the notion that it's all about programmability, I think, is their attempt really just to sort of rebrand Open RAN, because you can do a lot of that programmable stuff with traditional networks. I mean, Ericsson's pitch about programmability is not tied specifically to Open RAN. A lot of the stuff they're doing with 5G Advanced on purpose-built and closed interface platforms is programmable. Like all these applications they rolled out recently with their 5G Advanced launch are things that you would, that they're integrated into the base station. You provide it from a sort of distributed unit, and you, as an operator, you basically pay for access to a new license that does something whizzy like powering down base stations in the evening, and and that's kind of partly what they mean by programmability. So I don't think it's an Open RAN specific thing, but yeah.
What do you reckon, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think 2013, 2014, I started talking about BT programmable networks, and this was about, how do we enable users of the network to be able to pull things on demand? I think that, as Ian said, I think programmable networks was always a direction we were headed in and still headed in. I genuinely believe it. Where you can pull up a custom-made network by imagining it in code, and that's something that I spent a lot of time on actually making that real. Um, I think I have some sympathy for both points of view, both what the guy from AT&T said and Ian. I think, look, it's part of Open RAN, but also as part of standard other RAN. That was something that was getting baked in anyway. And at Juniper, we have a RIC platform, and we've done some work on SMO, which are the two things that enable this. And Ian's right. The other guys had SMO, which is sort of part of this, that's specific to their platforms, and it's about operational and control. But I think overall, the whole network programmability is a thing that is real and something that we need, frankly. So Open RAN definitely makes that easier because in theory, you've got a consistent set of interfaces that might expose capabilities to you. I got a slight nervousness about that because one person's radio versus another person's radio might behave in slightly different ways depending on how you program it. And actually, that's one of the big challenges that we've seen in networking since the start. You configure, BGP, which is one of the routing protocols we use. You configure that on one platform, it does X. You configure on another platform, and it does X minus 0.1%. Is slightly different. So I think there's some challenges with how you go about that. But ultimately, I do agree that if what the gentleman from AT&T said, I forget what you said his name was. If he was
Rob
saying that
Sonny.
Rob Sonny, so if Rob's saying, hey, we need to do more in programmable networks and Open RAN is a part of that, then I agree with it. Is it what it was originally created for? Probably not. But I think that whole network programmability was already a kind of a bandwagon that we were on because actually I think it's a good
Fair
one. I
enough.
think that will drive value. I mean, I think Open RAN. I'm seen as kind of lots of people come and say, "Oh, Neil, you're so anti Open RAN." I'm
They
not
say
pro.
that to Ian as well.
Yeah, I'm not pro or anti anything. What I'm pro or anti is what does this mean for customers? And that's where I kind of think, how's this really going to deliver? And also, if it was easy, why wouldn't we have already done it? And trying to accelerate effectively 50 years of radio technology into, a couple of years of development. I always looked at that and thought, really? And I found that challenging. And actually, but there's some great companies that have come out of it. Mavenir are doing some really great stuff, Rakuten, others. But I remember a discussion, where there was, we're getting pressure from, hey, we want to roll out Open RAN from governments and stuff, but there wasn't anything you couldn't buy it. It wasn't there. It wasn't ready yet. And there's a fear of, well, what if we buy something else? Does that mean we won't be? I was like, well, if here's the way I always saw it, and if you Google, you'll probably find me on YouTube saying this 10 years ago or however many years ago, which is, look, if Open RAN's really successful, everyone's going to pivot to it. And what's happened is Nokia and Ericsson and Samsung and I think Huawei will eventually, it's just a matter of time for them. They've all pivoted to it because it's become a demand that operators feel that it's valuable. Now, I think in the fullness of time, what we've seen is actually integrating different things together is really difficult. And we're in the business of providing network five nines. So the more pieces you've got, the more
Yeah.
that five nines becomes challenged. And then you also become, as the integrator, you become almost a part vendor where you've got to manage the life cycle of this. And that is so difficult.
Mm.
I've now got more exposure to that, having worked in Juniper for 2 years, where I get why some of the things I would say, why haven't you done this? I get why it's more difficult to do because you've got this overall life cycle that you have to manage and you have to keep secure and you have to modernize. So from my perspective, I think the path to programmability was almost always there. But that's more of a kind of generic networking trend that network as a service, which many service providers are looking at as a way of building new services on existing infrastructure by using code to define it, things like sovereign networks or highly resilient networks. And we've been working with BT on BT Fabric as the control plane for that, enabling that sort of capability is absolutely something that's probably the next 10 years of network development and probably the more valuable parts of network development. And that's where I then see AI playing a part in that, because you hear a lot about network APIs. APIs are for humans. AI is not going to need APIs. It's going to be able to, hey, you're going to have like two platforms that say, hey, I need this capability, and the other platform
Right.
say, well, I've got this, and here's how you use it. And I think that will be part of the RAN. It'll be part of the fixed network. It'll be part of the control plane. It'll be part of security. That kind of, handshake of
Yeah.
capability change, I believe, is going to be the big development over the next 10 years in networking.
The other thing about the programmability stuff, Scott, I'd say, is that if they're
Yeah.
saying that now, that it's now about programmability, does that mean they've given up on the original mission of diversifying?
I feel that yes, I think the answer to that is yes.
Because the problem then is like the companies doing RIC and XApps and RApps. I mean, that's a fairly small amount of value of the overall RAN market, yeah. And you're still like, if you look at the AT&T deployment, they're very heavily dependent on one company to do that. And nobody's saying this RAN market that's generating, what is it, $35 billion a year, I think at the moment is Omdia's latest figure in revenues. It's come down quite a lot. That's just projected to be flat over the next few years. I don't see the amount that's taken by the RIC is going to be a very big part of that. You're still going to be left with one or two options for your radio units and your baseband software and these sort of core elements. And that's not going to be more diversified than it was. So they don't provide.
One thing I typically agree with your thinking there, but there's one thing I would kind of question right now, which is, the RIC and SMO stuff is, there's some powerful capability. We have a platform. There's other platforms out there, but there's not a lot of networks to deploy it on right now because they're not Open RAN standard. So, and this is where I feel private networks is probably going to be the place that drives this. As people deploy more private networks that are typically lower capacity, lower demand, so you're not needing massive MIMO, you're not needing all the things that a public network needs. How you control, and this is one of the ways that we've done this private 5G and Wi-Fi, how you control that between the two, between the rest of your network capabilities and digital capabilities, how you control that, I do believe is going to become more important. Is it the RIC and Open RAN solution? I don't know, right? I think it's too early to say, but I do feel that controlling all, in this world of heterogeneous networks, the control plane that manages it all, that makes it painless for the user, is 100% a programmable platform, and 100% is something that's super important to the overall success and growth of what we're doing in networks.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna wrap up if that's all right, as I think we've somehow, even though we're remote and we're not in the studio, we managed to do a solid 2 hours anyway. And that's the cap. That's when Pierre,
It's easier to do it.
Still
Easier
with
to
it.
do it at home.
assuming Pierre's still alive, he would normally at this stage be giving me looks. And yeah, I'll just wrap up on that programmability side. I mean, that reminds me again of the conversation we had with Pablo, which came after. Yeah, Pierre just messaged and went, indeed. So he is still alive. That's good to hear, mate. Yeah, remind me of that, like when we were recapping on the Ericsson thing, and programmable networks is what they're all in on. And it's interesting to get that perspective from you, Neil, about how, it's not like we've just suddenly come up with this as a bright idea in the last couple of years. And yeah, I mean, that's the longer bit. I'm kind of with Ian on this rebranding of Open RAN. I think, yet again, just like the Gs, it was overhyped when it came along. It was the next big thing. It was a buzzword. Informo will have had entire trade shows based on it and all that sort of thing. And that's fine. I don't criticize Informa for that. I mean, that's what you do when you're doing market intelligence and B2B services. You've obviously got to be on top of what the latest trends are. But I think, 5 years down the line or so from when Open RAN first became a thing, it has needed to be redefined. And it's now just been merged into this broader network programmability thing, which, if you take Ericsson at face value, is what the kind of whole future of the mobile world is based on. So that's really what it comes down to for me. And I think we still don't know. And if we had more time, Neil, I might invite you to expand on it, but maybe that'll be for the next pod. We still don't know what this programmability is going to yield. It's still hard to see what the end point of it is. But I accept the argument that it's the way forward. It's just the way forward in a very nebulous, ill-defined way right now. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot for adapting to Pierre's plague. Pierre, I hope you get better. He's got to go off to the States next week, so I hope you get better then. And thank you for at least managing to stay upright long enough to record this remote pod.
Thank you, Pierre. Just one last word about
go for it.
MWC. One of the greatest things about MWC was meeting so many customers. I just being able to see people. That is the big value of that event.
I totally agree. It's all about human beings.
Exactly.
Especially when the main theme of it was everyone going on about AI and automation and about how we're all going to be obsolete. It was a good reminder that over 100,000 of us still think it's worth making the effort to go over there, spend tons of money on shitty hotels, and hang out with each other. So yeah, I completely agree. Right. Okay. Well, on that note, I will say thank you very much, Neil. Sorry we didn't get to meet in person, but hopefully we'll do it soon. I did see you very fleetingly at Mobile World Congress, I think outside the Ericsson stand, didn't I? And I'll say thank you to our audience for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.